We have a continuing action-packed schedule this afternoon. We're going to start with 4 more lightning talks, and then we will bring back the speakers from this morning, Tom, Chris, Adam, and Roger, for a panel discussion. So while you are listening to the lightning talks, you will not be bored or distracted, but if you are struck by a great question that you really want the panel to discuss, go ahead and throw it into Slido, and also vote for any questions that you particularly want to see the panel discuss. For those of you who are speaking, the first 2 are already mic'd up. Landoff and Diego, when you are up on deck, go over and see the staff member right there who will get you mic'd and ready to go. So our first presentation in the lightning talk section will be by Stephanie Barr, evaluating choice of climate change adaptation strategies for biodiversity conservation.
Great, we're good to go. Perfect. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for having me here in Miami. It's great to be here. So as I said, I'm Stephanie Barr. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And what I'll be presenting today is part of my doctoral work on evaluating choice of climate change adaptation strategies for biodiversity conservation. So protected areas have formed a cornerstone of conservation for the past century, and one of the primary methods for conserving biodiversity. But these protected areas were generally created under an assumption of a static climate system, which is no longer a valid assumption. So climate change is challenging the effectiveness of protected areas, intensifying existing threats, causing species redistributions, and leading to an unprecedented decline in biodiversity. And because of these changes, past and current methods of conservation may no longer be effective. So new approaches to conservation are needed under a changing climate. And in response to this need for new conservation strategies, academics have proposed numerous conservation or adaptation strategies in the literature over the past few decades. However, very few of these options have actually been implemented or evaluated in terms of their effectiveness, practicality, and feasibility. So I had the following research questions. What type of adaptation options do practitioners prefer? Does perceived effectiveness and feasibility vary by type of adaptation option? And why are interventionist actions less frequently implemented than conventional ones? So to evaluate these research questions, I attended a 2-day workshop that was held at the Bruce Peninsula National Park. And for those of you that are unfamiliar, it's located at the northern tip of the Bruce Peninsula in southern Ontario in central Canada. And participants represented numerous different organization types. They were primarily from Parks Canada, including other representatives from other parks in southern Ontario, but also included other federal departments, provincial and municipal governments, as well as NGOs, academics, as well as local Indigenous groups. And in total, there were 28 participants at the workshop, and it followed Parks Canada's climate change adaptation framework for parks and protected areas. It's not going to the next slide. There we go. So there are 5 steps in the framework. I'll talk about steps 2 and 3 in a bit more detail in a second. Steps 1 was to build a strong foundation, which was completed by Parks Canada prior to the workshop. And steps 4 and 5 are to implement adaptation options, as well as to monitor and evaluate. So steps 2 and 3, as I said, were completed at the workshop. So on day 1, step 2, assess vulnerability and risk, was completed. So participants identified plausible future climate change scenarios. They also identified impacts from those future climate scenarios. And then for each of these impacts that they identified, they evaluated the likelihood of that occurring on a scale of 1 to 5, as well as the consequence to the ecosystem if that impact were to occur. And from the likelihood and consequence rating, it gives you, is it a low-risk impact, a moderate-risk impact, or a high-risk impact? And then for each of those high-risk impacts that were developed on day 1, they developed adaptation options. And for each of those adaptation options, it was ranked again on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of its effectiveness and feasibility. So in total, there were 56 adaptation options developed through this workshop. This is an example on top, increase in forest fire intensity of a high-risk impact that was developed. And at the bottom are the adaptation options that participants developed to reduce that impact. And each of these adaptation options are given an effectiveness and a feasibility rating. So I collected all of these impacts and adaptation options that were identified, as well as the advantages and disadvantages of each option. And then I did some data analysis. So in terms of data analysis, I assigned each strategy to an intervention class. So that is conventional or interventionist. So conventional strategies are towards the left-hand side of this spectrum, and they are traditionally historically used. They're familiar to practitioners and are associated with less risk. And examples of these, in the case of biodiversity conservation, would be expanding the protected areas network, increasing connectivity, and reducing other threats. And at the other end of the spectrum are the interventionist strategies. So those are generally associated with higher risk and uncertainty and are often contentious. And examples of these could be conservation triage, dynamic reserves, and assisted migration. So adaptation strategies can also be categorized according to the action that they have on the ecosystem. So whether that is to resist change or to direct change. So strategies that aim to resist change are trying to maintain historic biotic and abiotic conditions and aim to reduce stressors on species and ecosystems. And at the other end of the spectrum are strategies that aim to direct change. So these strategies generally aim to help species and ecosystems respond to change and transition to desired future states. And in the middle of the spectrum there is accept change. I didn't include that in my analysis, but it is an option that you could include. But instead of trying to resist change or direct change in a certain direction, you're just accepting that change is happening and just allow that change to occur. So to help clarify these terms, I've included an example of sea level rise here at the bottom. Not relevant to my case study, but I wanted to include something that was relevant here in Florida. So if you're dealing with sea level rise, you could build seawalls to resist change and stop that salt water from intruding. If you're accepting change, you would just allow salt water to intrude and allow whatever saltwater habitat to arise. And if you're directing change, you would allow, again, that saltwater to intrude, but then plant specific species that are better adapted to that future climate that you're projecting. So in terms of my case study, you can see that the majority of the strategies that were identified are conventional strategies that aim to direct change. And you can also see that conventional strategies have a higher averaged out effectiveness and feasibility rating. And this could be because they are more familiar to practitioners and therefore better understood. Interventionist options may be less popular as their implementation forces society to make difficult choices about how we view and value nature, and therefore how we approach conservation. And in terms of the action that the strategy is aiming to have on the ecosystem, there's slightly more strategies that aim to direct change than resist change, but resisting strategies are still fairly prevalent. And the continued popularity of strategies that aim to resist change, despite their known incongruence with climate change, may stem from increased familiarity or certainty with these options. So it's generally accepted that adapting now to the impacts of climate change will lead to better outcomes than adapting later, and conservation practices need to change. So to assist with making progress on adaptation, I want to conclude by making the following recommendations. So there was an assumption in the 20th century when the concept of conservation was developed that you can set aside land and that the same species on that land will be present forever. So conservation, by definition, aims to preserve past conditions and resist change. However, to meet the challenges posed by climate change, conservation needs to take a future-oriented perspective. And agencies need to shift their perspectives from conventional static strategies that aim to preserve past conditions to more forward-thinking interventionist ones. And in a changing climate, species are forced to adjust their range or face population declines. Conventional practices that aim to maintain historical conditions can only cope with so much change and are likely unwise and perhaps even unachievable in a changing climate. On the other hand, though, strategic management actions that build adaptive capacity can reduce the loss of valued ecosystem services and ease the transition towards new states. So due to the complexity of ecological issues, there are no simple solutions that would address all problems, and there will always be advantages and disadvantages to every adaptation option. So to optimize the advantages and minimize disadvantages, a suite of complementary adaptation options should be implemented in conjunction with one another in order to reduce risk and uncertainty associated with a single adaptation strategy. And it's unlikely that any one adaptation strategy will be as effective in preserving something as complex as ecological integrity. So to create a paradigm shift towards interventionist adaptation strategies that direct change towards a desired future state, knowledge sharing within and between organizations needs to be increased, which will allow for the existing barrier of a lack of knowledge to be overcome. And knowledge sharing between organizations as to their experiences with climate change adaptation would help to increase confidence and reduce uncertainty about untried strategies. And this will also act to reduce the duplication of efforts and increase efficiency. Often when I talk to protected area organizations, they're afraid of trying something new and it failing due to a lack of resources. But likely another organization is facing a similar problem and can provide some insight to help them overcome that. So that's all for me. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Stephanie, and we've got time for a question. Anybody, anybody?
Great.
It's not kind of a vague question, but some of the questions you asked sound a little bit, although much more local and a different area, it sounds a little bit like adaptation and risk mitigation in the climate context. And I'm just wondering if you see that resonance and if you think the conclusions here have any parallel.
So you're asking about risk management and if this could be applied to that?
Well, so you talk about like an interventionist thing
Yeah.
of trying to, that's like geoengineering or something, you know?
For sure, yeah.
You can see some, although the scale is much smaller and some of the psychological and social
Yeah.
issues may be, you know, what the arguments against, so some of the arguments against geoengineering are in fact ecological, like, oh, some invasive species came and then in Australia and somebody introduced something else to eat it, but that was worse, you know, and I just wonder if this is an analogy that you think about as you're doing this work.
For sure, and definitely the whole idea of like conventional strategies versus interventionist or more forward-thinking strategies can be applied beyond biodiversity conservation. So if you're looking at a city, for example, you could stick with doing your historical measures, which may be able to cope for a certain amount of time, but eventually you need to transition towards more forward-thinking, more risky, maybe a bit uncertain strategies to cope with future change.
Great, thank you so much.